We begin with a blurb about a long-expected party of a particularly odd hobbit. We understand Bilbo Baggins, said host of the party, is rich and old, but he doesn't look it. Somehow he's managed to keep his age, looking younger and younger after seemingly returning from the dead from a long journey off to Lonely Mountain. If you're familiar with the book The Hobbit, you know exactly what he's been up to, and now he's returned, come back, and has been living in the Shire, and has been the focus and talk of much gossip. And so today we're going to be looking at Lord of the Rings and starting off with chapter 1, kind of taking it slowly and looking through each chapter in Lord of the Rings to see what it's made of, how it works, why it works, and just really, I'm rereading it again just for fun because it's been a number of years. And so for a story like this, there's 2 points that I like to keep in mind when going through any sort of story. The first is where we're going. We know where the story is going to be headed, with Rivendell, Ringwraiths, Moria, Rohan, Theoden, Gondor, Minas Morgul, Mordor, all of that. You would call these the big moments up here, high action, climax, things we've built to over hundreds and hundreds of pages. These are the amazing moments, but there's usually a requirement. You have to get to these moments. The audience has to get to those. Moria is like halfway through the book. Rohan Theoden, this is in the second book. All of these great, huge moments take time to build towards. And so how many people in your life have recommended a show or a book to you only to say, yeah, but you only made it 20 episodes or so far. You have to at least make it to 40 episodes in. That's when it really gets good. That's when it comes into it. It figures it out at that point. Or the same with the book. The first 200 pages are a bit slow, but after that, I couldn't put it down. I remember hearing somebody describe The Way of Kings Book 1. It was like, yeah, the first 600 or 700 pages are pretty slow, but the ending, man, you just can't beat it. And it's like, holy cow. Yeah. I don't know about that. I don't know if this is for me. So let me go down and below for the comments. If there's a book or show that's been pointed out to you guys that you kept getting these promise that at some point it'll get better, but you just couldn't quite reach it. And this brings me to the second point. The first is where we're going, these big moments that we're headed towards. The second is where the audience is at right now, where the reader is at now. It's trying to identify if a given story is at one of those sections. That's the really boring, the section, the slog, the part that's required to it. Because ideally in any given story, you don't have a slog ever. You can have low moments and high moments, small, quiet moments that take a little bit, that enjoy themselves, the slice of life, Studio Ghibli, you have all these moments of normal life. They're not bad just because high action isn't happening. None of it's bad. It's just you can't have non-stop action or else you exhaust the audience. Think of the Superman movies, the more Zack Snyder Superman movies, which is just punching for 2 hours. Or at least that's what I remember about the movie. I don't really remember anything else except for, Martha. From there, or Transformers, you have these type of stories that are selling that, but then most stories follow this where they'll have a low moment and then a high moment. You'll have a setup, you'll have non-jokes in between the jokes, the setup you have to make sure the audience makes it through those points until these high action moments, because also the low action makes the high action moments, and again, this is taking stock of where the reader is now. What this means is that we have to go through this party, the long expected party, the latest gossip of the Shire. We have to like Frodo. We have to watch him manage his affairs and wait around for Gandalf, go through the whole Farmer Maggot situation, mushrooms, Brandywine Bridge, forest, on and on and on and on, before we ever get to these big far off moments and far off lands with, kings and stuff like that. And this is what being a writer, and a good one, is all about. Depending on the story you want to tell, you may not want to start with a big action moment. This is not what we have here in Lord of the Rings. It's not a huge action moment, but by comparison, think Casino Royale. It makes sure that you make it 15 minutes or so into the story before you even realize, what's going on, because it wants to draw you in with this big action sequence and chase scene. It's a big moments that this movie starts off big, and Lord of the Rings isn't like that. We're starting off small. We're starting off day to day. It doesn't mean it has to be boring. The question is how does Tolkien do it? How does he ensure we make it through the slower moments, and not just give up, but also to enjoy them. Everyone I know would love to live in the Shire. It seems like this idyllic, amazing place, but what makes it interesting, And from the very first beginning, from the beginning pages of the story, we're introduced to Bilbo, this story. We're given this tension, this almost immediate tension in between this world building, all of this information. It's the juicy drama between the rich and mysterious Bilbo Baggins and the rest of the Shire. It's gossip. But still, we have this tension, and from the very beginning, and we have a lot of questions. And alongside the long expected party, we want to know more, which means we'll keep reading, which means we're interested. And one thing to appreciate for the first section of the story is just how much information is coming at us and how quickly. Tolkien just tells us, in the first 2 to 3 pages, we know all about Bilbo, Frodo, the party, and what everyone in the Shire thinks within a very short period of time. And keep this mantra. I try to keep this mantra in mind. If you can't be witty or alluring or exciting, be brief. And that's really what's important. If you're going to have a section where you're just like, man, I just don't know how to make it interesting, you don't have to. Just make it short. There's a bunch of stories that I've talked about with some friends and, family. And it's like this story was really well told. But the reason why it works is because it was short. It didn't overstay its welcome. And this is what we have to keep in mind because, again, we're trying to build this interest. And so what do we have? We have the story of Frodo that comes up, and it's told through a conversation between Ham Gamgee, Sam's dad, and some others at an inn, the Ivy Bush. And we learn about the death of Frodo's parents, how he came to be under Bilbo's care. And it's not just a telling of us necessarily. What we do is we have it plays out as this drama with this contrasted story. We have, Mr. Gamgee telling us all this information, and the people in the gossip who are making their assumption, saying, oh, Frodo's parents must have killed each other. And it's like, we have no reason to think that. And all these little small town gossip darts are getting thrown back and forth, which nobody really knows anything. You can really tell. Everybody's just talking out of their foot. But this is how we, the audience, are getting this information. And it's through this contested tension from here. The Sackville Baggins has come along with this, Frodo's parents must have viciously killed each other. And then we're also told about these untold riches. Bilbo must be Scrooge McDucking, bathing in all this gold. And all of it goes back to this talk of this party. But because, despite all these horrible things people think, nobody's not going to the party. Everybody's going to be there. Then Gandalf is introduced and there's mention of Bilbo's plan. There's this talk about this plan, but nothing more. And then we move on, and it's hard to remember that Gandalf at the beginning of the story is just kind of like he's selling himself as this small town fireworks maker. He's not this big character, but what it is he's just, slumming it more or less, enjoying himself in the vacation, if you will, back in the Shire. And it's always funny to see by contrast because everybody thinks of Gandalf as, the big moments, the you shall not pass moments or anything like that. And then they move on. You have to remind myself this is who Gandalf is right now, and not necessarily always to see him only as what he will be down the road. And, looking at the story, I always love it when they fish out these little remarks or have these little comments and then build on them later. It's like sewing inside jokes. And this one is a very important one. It's important to do this because you're getting the audience to ask questions. And then if they're asking questions, they want to see the answer, which means they're interested in the story. They want to solve it. This is what it means to be on the inside. They want to be in on the joke. They want to be in and know what's going on. And this is where you're building this. And so we want to watch and read and figure out what happens. And it's also see these little moments are brought back up. Each comment is resolved and neatly buttoned up into the story. And we feel like everything's coming together. And for this long expected party, the preparation begins in earnest. And there's all these little things that Tolkien's doing to signify and build excitement, but not just build excitement in the Shire, but to build it for the audience. There's all these little markers that we're looking for, these measurements to tell us, the audience, as to why the other characters should be excited. Because basically, if you can sell the audience that, oh, I understand why this character in this book should be excited, the audience themselves is going to be dragged along with it. This is how you do it. It's the 1-2 from there. If I can sell the audience and they get, they're on the inside as to why this should be exciting, they will become excited and want to see. We already have the gossipers in the Shire who dislike Bilbo, but nonetheless, every single one of them is going to show up to this party. The local post office is getting drowned in letters that are just, ornately and ordained. They're just beautiful. They have to hire more help just to keep up. A tent is being set up on this field and everything is hush-hush and secret. And, this is always that great question. What's a great way to make people interested in a secret? Tell them to stay away and mind their own business, and then we, the audience, operate operate on the same emotions that these characters, if the story is well written and all this food and drink has been brought, everything is building and building and building to this moment. And so now here, again, we know where the story for Lord of the Rings is going, but right now we're just in the Shire and we want to see what's going on with this party. And the party comes, it's food, drink, presents for everyone. Fireworks are shot off, courtesy of Gandalf. The big firework dragon goes off and it's dinner time. All the while, Tolkien's doing a great job of interlacing this world building with action, with dialogue, with description and repeat. It's not just, hey, we're going to do a whole bunch of world building, a whole bunch of description, a whole bunch of this, a whole bunch of that. It's all interlaced through this party. So we're getting all of this. It begins, with a list of all those names of everyone in the Shire and the relations to Bilbo and everything like that. Imagine if it had started that way. When a story begins, generally we don't really care about the characters. We will, hopefully, but we need to be drawn in. And once we are, we'll sit through genealogy and summary of everybody's relations in the Shire. It just takes a while to build to that point. We move on and everyone starts dreading this speech by the host. All the characters are just like, oh no, all the other guests are dreading this moment from Bilbo. And so now, again, as the party is drawing to its end, as we've kind of answered this question, we're setting up for another question. Okay, as the party is drawing to an end, what is Bilbo going to say? You're trying to point and prepare the audience saying, hey, you really need to stick around and see what's going on. And how do we do that? By making everybody dread it. Everybody's like, oh, it's going to be awful. And so again, the other thing we're doing is the speech itself gets broken up. We've broken up into parts, the live audience reaction. So Bilbo's making a speech, we get a reaction. It's making a speech and then get a reaction. We have all these little tidbits and mention of places, the toy gifts Bilbo's been handing out, being marked Dale, from the Lonely Mountain. And the folks in the party are starting to get restless and they're starting to get boring, and Bilbo blasts the horn to keep them interested and no, don't worry. I shall not keep you long. Now we're getting to the good part. We're understanding, okay, we're getting to the closing into this, and all this intro is nice, but it doesn't tell us anything yet. We don't know what Bilbo's plan is. We don't know what's going on. And Bilbo talks about the years and he keeps adding announcements, keep adding, more and more and more and more until his third and final announcement. This is the end. He's leaving. Goodbye. And then poof, he vanishes. And this is part of the magic of Lord of the Rings. You see in action movies and the like, the action usually, the action going on in the story, in the plot starts up here and then it goes down and then it builds up and then it goes down and then builds up and up and up and up and up. And there are these high moments. But by contrast, there's no drastic difference. You start off at a high note and then maybe you'll have some lulls. But you're always at 11. You're always turning it up to 11. It's almost in the moments where, Fast and Furious, where you keep slamming on the brakes. It's like at some point it gets a little silly, but if you start off the race with slamming on the brake, you can't end on it with, just lully, strolling in past the victory line. You have to have this explode. You have to keep it at 11. Think of this as Transformers explosions and stuff like that versus Oppenheimer explosion. It's one explosion versus like 2 hours of explosions. And you can argue that the Transformers is more spectacular, but the lead up, think of that lead up for Oppenheimer towards that one big explosion. Think Jack's pistol from Pirates of the Caribbean, that single shot he's been holding on. All of that for a single moment. What does that single shot signify? And people remember that moment versus the thousands of shots in the whole movie that just are seemingly meaningless. It's the lead up that signifies and makes this have meaning. And so for Lord of the Rings, we're starting off down here. Again, doesn't have to be boring. It's just slower. It's a different pace. There's different stakes. Think Jane Austen books. Her books are famous for being realistic and fantastic, but they don't have these explosive moments. They start off low and then build to a moment that feels real. It feels real. And when the characters get a happily ever after, it feels huge because a happily ever after in real life doesn't always happen. It means a lot versus, in a story where, if happily ever afters are a dime a dozen, the fact that it feels real makes it mean something more to us. And so we start the audience off with quaint Shire life. And now we've had our first real big shift. The Shire feels real because we know these people, the gossipers. These are people you meet in the grocery store, in traffic, at church, friends' houses, gossip, argue, food, drink, letters, day to day, this slice of life for the Shire is doing this, but it can't be boring. Again, it can't be boring or else we'll never make it to these big moments. But now we've had something different shift. The story in the world feels real, but people don't vanish in real life. And in due course, every time everyone at the party, all the hobbits think it's a bad taste, but then they move on because what can you do? This is real life. The day after hits and Frodo's got to deal with it. And Bilbo, right after he vanishes, before Frodo takes over or anything like that, Bilbo goes back to the house, meets Gandalf, and we're introduced, more to this golden ring, the thing that's responsible for Bilbo's vanishing trick. And here we transition into another moment of tension there. I talk about tension as a great way to garner interest because you're asking the audience to pick a side, who's right. And we're trying to figure out who's right. And when you're trying to figure out who's right, you're moving deeper and deeper into the story, which means you're interested. And so Gandalf and Bilbo starts off as a simple goodbye. Gandalf's like, you're going to leave Frodo the ring, right? It's really important you leave the ring. And Bilbo's like, yeah, sure. I guess. Maybe not. Maybe I'll take it with me. And there's this like showdown moment. And then Bilbo leaves and then takes, hops off with 3 dwarves and then leaves. He leaves the Shire. And from there, and then now we have this shift. Frodo, who up until this moment has been nothing more than a side character of interest, takes over as the main character. Frodo's been introduced, but we heard of him through gossipers and ham-gamgee around town. But now that Bilbo is gone, Frodo's now the point of view. It transitions from Bilbo to Gandalf, and then Gandalf suddenly leaves, and now Frodo's in charge of picking up all the pieces. He's now our point of view. Bilbo's left a lot of gifts to specific hobbits, and we get a better idea of that British snark. He has this vain niece that Bilbo leaves a mirror to, a man who borrows books and never returns them. Bilbo gives him a bookcase. A man who never writes back, he gives him a pen. A woman who writes, advice column in the area, he gives her a trash can. Lobelia Sackville Baggins, who's, he's pretty sure is stolen a bunch of his spoons when he was away at the Lonely Mountain. He gives her another set of spoons, which, is such a great moment of Bilbo's character where he's like, he's got to the point of his life where he can spend his money just to screw with people and just poke them in the eye a little bit. But now Bilbo's gone. And now Frodo has to pick up the pieces. He hands out the gifts and, party's taken down, apologizes, tries to clean up the mess. Merry comes back in to help because, they're cousins, I think. And then Gandalf appears and tells him, whatever you do, don't use the ring, and then just dashes off again. And now Frodo is master of Bag End. This is his life. And again, what we're setting up here is we kind of close the loop on this little single story of the party. The party has been answered, but now all these different breadcrumbs we've answered. Where did Bilbo go? We still don't even know where he went. We didn't even realize he was leaving until halfway through or how he was going to do it. And then poof, he's gone off to the, who knows where. And then Gandalf comes back and suddenly he's making a big deal about this ring. And then he's being very cryptic and not very helpful. And then he vanishes. And then Frodo's just here living life. So what have we done? We've set up Frodo to basically have this normal life, but it be really interesting because we want to know what's going to happen. We need to know what Frodo's going to do. He's trying to pick up these pieces. But again, at this point, we're keeping this action. This is a low action moment, but it's really interesting. We have to draw people in. We're using all, this tension, this world building. So at the end of this first chapter, we're left with this amazing amount of knowledge about the Shire, the relations, all this little gossip, all this moments, Gandalf, the ring, Bilbo, dwarves, elves, all about this world, this interconnected world. And this is chapter 1. And we're still interested, which means, again, we're getting closer to these big moments, to the end of the story, which is the ultimate goal. You want to get your audience through your story, for any sort of story writer. As an audience, I want to get through the story. You want somebody to bring you through to the end. And it's all built up with these little moments. And all of this within the first chapter. It's this whirlwind to bring us forward, because again, this is Frodo's life. We see Frodo's life so many times. You think of Frodo's life as, okay, he lived for a tiny bit for like 5 minutes in the Shire, and then like everything else is him like traveling, on the road in Moria, in the swamps, the Dead Man Marsh or whatever those are called in Moria, Minas Morgul, all these different places. And those big moments are made by this. We're realizing this is where Frodo came from. This is his life. He was actually a real character. And this is what makes this moment, this decision Frodo makes, to take the ring to Mordor. This is what we're building towards right now. This is what makes those big moments significant. And yeah, so thank you all for joining me. I'm not a Tolkien expert by any stretch of the imagination if it's not clear, but I really love Lord of the Rings, and I just love looking at the stories and trying to see how it works. And I really wanted to take a slow look through it and methodical look through the whole trilogy and see how and why it works. I'm looking at chapter 2 next. Let me know down in the comments what you think. I really appreciate it. Please do like and subscribe. It really does help the channel out. And I hope to see you all then. I'm Jeff Cassidy, and this is Fiction Applied.